This week's episode is brought to you by Manscaped.com. Use promo code WrestlingFuture for 20% off your purchase. Manscaped.com and the Lawnmower 3.0. Your balls will thank you.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another edition of Wrestling with the Future, the first edition of the new Wrestling with the Future podcast. As you can tell, we've changed the channel up a little bit. Recent announcements. From now on, Tuesdays, Angelo is going to have a Wrestling with the Future of whatever the topic is. It's going to be everything from entertainment to the world. And Thursdays, we're going to stick with our core in wrestling. I will be hosting Thursday's show, Wrestling with the Future podcast, joined by my new co-host, Benny. Benny, how you doing today?
Good. I'm giving everybody a New Year's love.
There you go.
Like the Bee Gees, I'm just trying to stay alive, which these days is a challenge.
Ain't that the truth? Sometimes that's the best you can ask for.
Yeah, one day at a time.
Right. Well, it's funny. We had the first show of the new podcast, and I wanted this to be a retrospective, a look back at wrestling of 2020. It was a unique year, to say the least, and I wanted to focus on the positives. But before we get to that, Benny, you said you had something you wanted to put out, so let's talk about that first.
Yeah, so the last show we did, and I guess it was on the 29th, Brody Lee had passed away, I believe, the day before, and he was the last wrestling casualty of 2020. And yesterday we had our first one of 2021, which was, you got to be an old-timer for this one, it was Bobby Davis. Bobby Davis was actually Buddy Rogers' manager when Buddy was the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. And Bobby was a young guy. I mean, to me, Jim Cornette in 1985 was Buddy Rogers. It was Bobby Davis in 1960. Bobby was a trendsetter, and he was very young when he managed Buddy. He was in his early 20s. Very flamboyant, very articulate, and so I mean to manage the World Heavyweight Champion and at that time the NWA Champion was everything. That was the kingpin. That was very prestigious.
Yeah, that was the biggest title in the world at the time.
Right, and so I first saw Bobby Davis. I started watching in 1968, and Bobby was still around. He was managing somebody named Virgil Butcher. I think his real name was John Quinn. He wrestled in several different territories, but he was the Kentucky Butcher. And, WWF back in the day was very formulaic. They brought in a new heel. He went through the rounds, went through all the guys, build up for the big match with Bruno at the Garden. Sometimes that lasted
the monster of the week kind
of. Right, yeah. Usually, and then if it was really good, it lasted maybe, there was 3 matches at the Garden if it was a really good series. But sometimes it was only one. But so he managed Virgil Butcher. And then, back then, Arnold Skolin was Bruno's manager, who went on to become Bob Backlund's manager. But so Arnold was one of those guys that, the new heel would go through on the way to facing Bruno. And and Butcher's signature move was the pile driver.
Okay.
And so about 5 or 6 guys in a row he pile drive. Can't even think of the guys' names who he did it to, and then he faces Arnold Skolin. So it does same ending, and then so they could bring out the stretcher, and they're still in the ring. You got 2 referees, holding each end of the stretcher, and Virgil Butcher and Bobby Davis both take the stretcher and just like upend it. And literally Arnold Skolin went flying over the top rope, and he landed on the cement. And back then the announcer was Ray Morgan.
Okay.
And so the next week, Ray Morgan came on the air, and I actually told the story on Facebook a couple of times. He gave the address at White Plains Hospital, because I guess that's where Arnold was from, to where everybody could send cards and letters. So to this day, I don't know if the guy legit got hurt or that was just that really was a great buildup.
Back when kayfabe meant something.
Oh yeah, but I have to think that Bobby Davis had to hide out in trunks of cars after that, going like Larry Zbyszko after he turned on Bruno.
Right.
But he was just, and then he left the business very early, because that was 68. I think he was born in 37. So he would have been like 31, which, for a wrestling manager is, is very, very young.
Usually the managers are the older characters.
Right. But I guess at some point he did wrestle, but, albeit for a very short period of time. But his heart was in managing. He left, I think, in 68 or 69. And then apparently he knew Dave Thomas, the founder of Wendy's.
Okay.
And he bought himself, I guess he owned about a dozen Wendy's, did very well, then got into real estate and kind of became a recluse, because you really didn't, most people, unless they were around at that time, mean, you kind of know who Bobby Davis was,
Yeah.
but he really didn't. He kind of just went into hibernation after that. And I think about 6 months ago, I heard an interview. I forgot who did it with him, and I think like I thought he was dead by now. I had no idea because I hadn't heard from him in years and years. But yeah, so he's our first one, and hopefully there aren't too many more after that. But he brought to me special meaning because, like I said, when I first started watching, here I am, a 13-year-old kid, and I bought into everything 100%.
Right.
And when I saw that stretcher go out of the ring, I mean, horrified wasn't even the word. I came to imagine but yeah, back then, to me, everything, it was all real.
Yeah. No, I can understand that, and that's it's a shame. I mean, clearly a long, fruitful life, but our still Wrestling with the Future family, our condolences go out to his kin and his family for that. But hopefully, to move to a more positive note, as I said at the top of the show, I wanted to focus this episode on Wrestling 2020, but in recent events and some things that have occurred we're not going to get into, I wanted it to be positive. There's been a lot of negative in the last couple of days that have really kind of punched people in the mouth, and I wanted to make this a positive. So we're going to kind of focus on the good things from wrestling in 2020. And I want to start with the obvious, and that's that there was still wrestling in 2020.
Right.
Really, I mean, you had a global pandemic of a scale that we haven't seen in anybody's living's lifetime.
Not in my lifetime.
They were comparing it to the influenza in 1917. But, I mean, you had record shutdowns, across the board, across the world, events being canceled, conventions and exhibits and sporting events. The XFL ended up folding because it couldn't operate anymore for events and games. But wrestling chugged along. Now, granted, there was the story, obviously, that came out of Florida, that the money that went from Vince McMahon to Florida's governor, who then declared wrestling an essential service. And obviously AEW was able to get away with it because the Khan family owns the entire facility they're filming in. But really the beginning of realizing that wrestling was going to chug along was the build up to WrestleMania, which is something else I'm going to get into here in a minute. And Benny, I want your thoughts on this, but the build up to WrestleMania, they started having some of the empty shows, the empty arenas, and some of the hype behind WrestleMania actually, I feel as a fan and as someone who was kind of following it, worked better without the crowds because they were able to tell a better story without, the WrestleMania crowds tend to hijack shows. And I don't mean that as a criticism. It's part of the fun, but you're able to tell some of the story. So I'm wondering your thoughts on the success. Well, we'll get to success in a minute, but the fact that despite everything, you had AEW and WWE continue, and some of the other promotions, AAA, New Japan, and now we're seeing Ring of Honor are starting to come back. So I wanted your thoughts on that being one of the good things of 2020 is that wrestling was still around.
Yeah, and when the pandemic first struck, I really thought, well, that's one thing that's not going to happen. I mean, I kind of accepted baseball, football, and I thought, well, I guess wrestling's going to follow suit. And I have to say, I mean, it was different and it was an adjustment. And watching, and the funny thing was I haven't really watched a whole lot of, I'm still buried in 1970. And but I watched a promo between Roman Reigns and Drew McIntyre. I watched it last night, and just to see how they're doing the graphics with the fake crowd and everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so surreal.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the crowd because that's something I want to focus on. Part of the fun of watching wrestling in the empty, what was dubbed the empty arena era, was the evolution, because some of the first shows, and we talked about it in our podcast last year, episodes of Wrestling with the Future last year, where you watched wrestlers who didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to act without an audience. They would do a move and then hot dog or hype up a crowd or turn to the crowd and do and there was nobody there. They were reacting to a crowd that was empty. They would do moves that played off the crowd that didn't work in the silent era. And then over time, you watched performers their grunting got a little smaller, their communication got a little better and a little quieter. Some of the quality of the matches improved. And it was interesting because you saw it across AEW and WWE, where the wrestlers got much better at working in empty crowds. And I think that culminated in WrestleMania, which, and I know opinions aside at the WWE, I thought this year's WrestleMania, or last year's WrestleMania 30, what was WrestleMania 36, was one of the better shows they've done in a long time. You had some very good quality matches. Obviously, the other thing that we'll touch on here in a minute is that was the first pay-per-view to feature what they call the cinema matches, the movie matches.
Right.
Obviously there was the Boneyard match with the Undertaker and AJ Styles, and the Firefly Funhouse match with John Cena and Bray Wyatt. And interestingly enough, both of those matches were John Cena and the Undertaker's last appearance, respectively, as active competitors. Even though the Firefly Funhouse wasn't really a match as much as it was just a series of clips, whereas the Boneyard match between AJ Styles and Undertaker actually presented itself as a fight. But you had good moments, you had good matches. Obviously, I mentioned it. I think you were on the show with us when we talked about some of the positives. Drew McIntyre finally getting to the top of the mountain, beating Brock Lesnar. And I think, too, if I can backtrack for just a second, that the empty arena era hit, I don't want to say at a perfect time, because there's never a perfect time for something like this, but the last big crowd the WWE performed in front of was the Royal Rumble. And between Edge's return, which is another huge positive from last year, and Drew McIntyre winning and eliminating Lesnar, and some of the moments that happened at the Rumble, I think if you were going to pick a show to have your last show in front of a crowd, I think that would have been a better one than having the crowd be at WrestleMania.
Right.
But I want your thoughts on that, because you mentioned you talked about what WWE calls the Thunderdome, where they built the arena of the TV screens around the ring, and fans can live stream the event and be seen in the crowd. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, where eventually they adapted.
Well, and say what you want. I mean, like I said, I'm not a huge fan of modern wrestling. I probably never will be, but, I'm a huge sports fan, and, a ball player, a football player, a basketball player, they didn't really have to adjust their game. They play, yes, instead of playing in front of a crowd, they're playing to an empty arena. But, by and large, I mean, pitcher's going to throw the same pitch, and the guys, the batter's still going to look for the same pitch.
Right.
And, and if a fly ball's hit, the outfielder's still going to chase it the same way. Whereas, like, these guys had to completely revamp their game, I think. Mm-hmm. Because, like you said, I mean, part of the whole wrestling thing is, when they do a move, the first thing you're going to do, especially if you're a heel, you're going to look out to the crowd. Say, how do you like that? And you can't do that anymore.
Yeah,
so, like, for them to,
you can't hot dog in the arena.
They really had to take their game to a new level. So I give these guys all the credit in the world, for doing what they've done to keep it going.
Yeah, and I like I said, I definitely thought the way they adapted, opinion of the modern product aside, I think there is some good out there. I've said it before on the show. A lot of what the modern product is sucks, in my opinion, because and we've talked about, how many times have we talked about it on the show? The second the bell rings, million miles an hour, high spot.
Right.
And there's no story. I actually think some people, and I mentioned Drew McIntyre earlier, some people have excelled in the empty arena era in over the last year, because without being able to hot dog or play to a crowd, they had to develop ring psychology. There were some performers last year that had better matches than they ever would have in a crowd, because they had to change. And speaking of change, and this is something I want your thoughts on, is another good thing that came out of last year was the explosion of talent. And I mean that in a lot of the older performers, the part-timers, your John Cena's, your Undertaker, a lot of them went kind of to the wayside as younger talent took over, because they couldn't or wouldn't compete in the COVID era. Even AEW, which focused a good chunk of its storyline around Chris Jericho, pushed a lot of young talent. talent being a relative term for some of their performers, but I mean names like Orange Cassidy and Darby Allin, who came in through AEW and WWE with obviously a heel Roman Reigns, which is another great thing that happened last year. We'll talk about characters here shortly. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Is now's the time? And you mentioned NXT and AEW to that let your young talent take over.
Yeah, and it's like, the Yankees now. The Yankees for years, and I'm a huge Yankee fan. For years and years, they were one of the older teams in the major leagues.
Right.
And a lot of that was because they basically bought their talent, through free agency. And now, there's a whole crop of guys on the Yankees. You got your Aaron Judge, you got your Gleyber Torres, you got Sebi, you got a whole bunch of guys, Gary Sanchez, who were all systems of the farm system, products of the farm system. And it's just so nice because like these guys are all in their early 20s. So if they can hold on to them, I mean, for years and years now, they're going to be a competitive team with their own ingrown products.
Yeah, and I'm a fan of Washington sports, and the Washington football team made the playoffs. They play this weekend. The heart and soul of their team right now is their offensive line, which is four first-round draft picks over the last 4 years. I mean, there was a team that was notorious for its high spending of older free agents, and they stopped and started building around young talent. And here they are in the playoffs. I think that time and time again, and wrestling's proved it for every, and how many times have we talked about it on the show where you have your Vern Gagne's, your Nick Bockwinkel's, even to a point, your Bruno, where you can't keep a crowd. Memphis was another great example. You can't with Jerry Lawler and Dutch Mantel and all. You can't keep a crowd with the same three people in your main event for 20 years. I mean, obviously, maybe Bruno at Madison Square Garden, but I want to transition. Speaking of talent, to another high point that I think from last year, and correct me if you disagree with me on this one, is without fans, they were able to, and I mentioned this a minute ago, is they were able to develop characters that have worked on television. And I think that the two biggest that jump out at me is Roman Reigns came back from his self-withdrawal because he stepped away from wrestling because he was immunocompromised. And obviously that's a terrible time to be around during a pandemic. But Roman Reigns, for those that haven't been watching, he's now doing what they call the high chief or the head of the table.
Head of the table, right?
Yeah. Heel Roman Reigns is one of the best things the WWE has had in years. I watch him and think the way people reacted to the early days of The Fiend or some of the younger NXT talent, where you like Rhea Ripley, where you look at and you're like, okay, this is something you can build around. And I think Raw and SmackDown's numbers have reflected that. On the AEW side, and I know this might not be overly popular because I'm personally not a fan of him, but I have to give AEW credit for what they did with Orange Cassidy. And that's a character who's, and I've mentioned it on the show, his entire gimmick is, I don't take this seriously. Basically, wrestling is fake. Look at me. I've got my hands in my pockets.
Hands in his pockets, yeah.
Light kicks and all. But AEW has continued to beat NXT. Their numbers have gone up. Their t-shirts, he was the number one mover last year for a good chunk of time on t-shirts and merchandise. I mean, you took a guy who was basically what's it called? A niche gimmick on the indie scene and made him one of the most popular wrestlers on American television.
Right.
Love him or hate him, you wouldn't have been able to do that with a live crowd because you were able to mold the story around the people that you had in your people that you didn't have in your audience.
Absolutely. And getting back to Roman Reigns, I mean, for so long he was a babyface who was pretty much treated like a heel by the fans. And I remember like 3 or 4 years ago he kind of teased going heel when he said he's not a good guy, he's not a bad guy, he's just the guy. And they booed him for that too. And then, I mean, like I said, I haven't watched the product for a while, but I did watch last night, and it was the first time I saw, like, heel Roman Reigns. And I'm like, what did you guys wait for? Like, this is great.
Yeah.
I mean, you could tell he was enjoying himself, too. and he was such a
Right.
natural at it.
Well, and I think it's worked out well on the Roman Reigns side because you have your talent like Kevin Owens, and there's certain players that SmackDown has that are perfect foils for the Roman Reigns character that wouldn't have worked. A Kevin Owens Roman Reigns match wouldn't have highlighted a pay-per-view when Roman Reigns is the most booed face you've got. But he works as a heel because Owens works as a conquering hero. And you've said it before on the show, you and Angelo had talked about it in the past, is a good character, be it a Jim Cornette, like you mentioned, the Midnight Express, the Road Warriors, going as far back as someone like a Jerry Lawler or the Von Erichs. If you're good enough, you make everyone around you better just by default.
Right.
And Roman Reigns is Roman Reigns is such a good character. The faces that he goes against get a rub and a push and a bump just because of how good he is as a heel, that they have to raise their game just to make it interesting.
Yeah, I didn't think I was going to enjoy it. I thought, I'm going to do this show tomorrow. I got to watch this. This way, I think I could say I watched it, and I was pleasantly surprised. I did not expect to see. And the funny thing was Paul Heyman, who's supposed to be the mouthpiece,
right,
didn't really say anything, and he didn't really need to.
Yeah, and unlike Brock Lesnar, who can't talk pretty much at all, that having Heyman as a mouthpiece and Roman Reigns, who's a good talker, and gotten much better on the promo in the last few years. I'll give him that. He's greatly improved. I think that works. And I want to use that, if we can, Benny, to transition another good bit, since we were talking about SmackDown. One of the centerpieces of SmackDown, especially during the summer, was their women's division. You had the reign of Bayley and Sasha Banks and Carmella, and you had just a really dominant women's division, and a Raw with Asuka and Charlotte, and it was they were able to step up because a good chunk of last year, Charlotte and Becky Lynch, who were your two biggest stars going into 2020, were gone for a good chunk of the year. So a lot of the women stepped up. NXT, many commentators, even those critical of the modern product, have said NXT's women's division is one of the best they've seen ever, especially in the modern times. AEW, their women's division is catching up, maybe. I don't know. It's like 5th place out of 3rd, out of 3, maybe. But I think it's important to note that a lot of the success that's come, especially on SmackDown side, and we'll talk about ratings towards the end, came from the women's division. And I think it's important because we've talked about it on the show before, that with our, we obviously had shows where we talked about Moolah, and we've had several high profile female guests on, everybody, Baby Doll on down, that the women can make or break a show if you have good female talent. And I think a big plus of 2020 was how the female competitors were able to step up in such a way. I mean, Rhea Ripley's one of the best female talents I've ever seen, and she was absolutely incredible last year. Her matching at Charlotte, again, I talked about WrestleMania earlier, I think that's one of the best matches of the year, period. But I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the success of women's wrestling over 2020.
It's really funny because one of my notes here is, and again, last night I watched NWA Shockwave, and I watched the last show of 2020, and it was a great show, but by far the best match was the NWA Women's Title match between Thunder Rosa and Serena Deeb, who I think actually is a trainer she was a trainer for NXT, I believe.
Yes.
And I mean, it had to be like between 15 and 20-minute match, and I sat there mesmerized. And actually, the title changed hands. Serena won the title, and I mean, but what a show they put on! It was nothing else in the show even came remotely close to it. And at the end, Serena Deeb did this promo where she said, now she's gonna. I think she invoked the name of Mildred Burke. I guess what they're trying to do is bring back the significance of the NWA. By using some of the past names. And I just thought they did a really good job. But I mean, as far as the women, they by far did the best job on that show last night.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, it's funny, you talk about them bringing back the glory of the NWA. I've mentioned it before on the show. One of my favorite moments in the last few years of wrestling was an NWA Power episode where the Rock and Roll Express, who were my favorites growing up, won the NWA tag titles. And Jim Cornette, who was who was a ring announcer at the time, before the incidents that got him that he retired. He threw his headset down and jumped in the ring, and he was hugging Ricky Morton, and Robert Gibson was, and it was genuine, and the crowd loved it.
It definitely.
And I mean, Ricky Morton still has the prettiest mullet in the business
Wonderful,
all these years later. But it's I like the mix, and that's something that I think AEW did really well over the last year. Was you can use your older talent without using them at the expense of your younger talent.
Right.
The WWE has a really bad habit of bringing in legends for one-offs, or unfortunately, the main event at the upcoming Royal Rumble, Drew McIntyre is going to be defending the WWE title against Goldberg.
How old is Goldberg now? I think 55.
103 or something like that.
Yeah, that might be it. Yeah.
Yeah, but so I mean, they did a Legends Night celebration of old talent, and it ended with Goldberg coming out and challenging for the title. Like, why? You've got all these younger guys, and heaven forbid if he wins it. But AEW, with the way they did with Jericho and the NWA, I think that's last year was a good passing of the torch moment, to go off of what you said. But Thunder Rosa is another talent who I mentioned how AEW's women's division is catching up. She obviously, with the talent sharing they have, she competed in AEW as well and has done a great job there. Her and Britt Baker, and some of the better segments, especially the backstage bits with Britt Baker and Tony Schiavone, have been some of the more entertaining things AEW's done this year. In a year that I've been overly critical of their product, I will give credit where credit's due. That's been a big thing. I'm sorry, I'm just kind of checking off notes as we go. Another positive I wanted to talk about, obviously we touched on the women's division, and we touched on the young talent, is the evolution. You mentioned it earlier. You talked about how talent, their move set and everything is just the evolution of the business. I know it's kind of a double-bladed sword in some sense, as ratings have come and gone. But the social media presence of wrestling last year took over, especially with COVID. YouTube, AEW Dark being an internet exclusive show, the WWE using the living bejeebs out of the network for their specials and pay-per-views that they still ran in empty buildings. I think 2020 was kind of a year where they had no choice to evolve, and that's something, credit where credit's due. Again, Vince McMahon, when you paint him into a corner, they'll come up with something to break the trend or still be entertaining. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how social media in the modern age kind of took over wrestling last year.
Well, like you said, I mean, their backs were up against the wall and they had to do something. And I really think they delivered. I mean, I think, as a wrestling fan, maybe you couldn't go to shows, but there was, content galore out there.
Right.
You weren't, you still had your choice of what you wanted to watch, and there was no shortage of it. So, again, I give them a lot of credit. They did what they had to do. They kept it in the public eye, and I think they did a great job. And they elevated some guys. Honestly, there are many, many young guys out there like MJF in AEW.
That's a good one.
There's a guy you're going to be talking about for the next 15 years.
Oh yeah, he's one of the best pure heels. I wasn't a big fan of that song and dance number they did, him and Jericho, but I think he's got the skills, just that natural it factor. They always say wrestling, there's that one thing you can't teach. He's got the it factor to be just a natural heel. But yeah, MJF's a great example. I think I mentioned Darby Allin. They're kind of building him up almost as a Sting-esque character, which AEW, he's been working with Sting now that Sting's in AEW. And that's actually another positive thing I wanted to talk about was AEW has they're still hit and miss. Obviously there's a lot of old school wrestling fans, people older than me. I'm only 37, but people older than me who will never watch AEW. They'll never give it a chance. Even some people my age have been turned off by the flips and the kicks and the 20 DDTs and 50 super kicks a match. But AEW has also delivered moments. I know people, yourself included, who don't watch the modern product that have talked to me at work and in passing about, hey, I saw this thing on YouTube and it was amazing. And 9 times out of 10, those moments involved the Rhodes brothers. And I think that's something in 2020 was Cody and Dustin, the way they performed. And now that they actually have that name back, from what I understand, that they performed in AEW, I want to give them credit. 2020 was the year of the Rhodes brothers, between Cody's run with the TNT title, which, unrelated side note, they retired the original design of the TNT title, the red belt. Yeah. They gave it to Brody Lee Jr. They reintroduced a new design. It's a very similar looking belt, except the strap is black. I think it's pretty. I think it's a good homage that you've retired the old design, and it'll stick with Brody Lee's family, because he kind of had the big red strap for a while. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. If I don't know what you follow with AEW, if you have any thoughts on how successful the Rhodes brothers were last year.
I kind of like scratched WWE off my list, but I really think I should give AEW a chance, and I haven't, but I think I should. And one of the things I like that they've done is that they brought back Sting, they brought back DDP, they Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, I think Jake Roberts as well.
Yes,
and not to but they're doing it, I think, in a good way, where they're not like bringing back a Goldberg is going to deprive somebody of that match. I think they're doing it in a lot better way, where they're not going to push somebody else out of a spot. They're using them a lot better. So I think in fairness to them, I feel like I ought to give them a shot.
There you go. Can't argue with that logic. Well, as we approach the halfway point of our show, Benny, you want to give a shout out to the sponsor of our new program?
Oh, I thought you'd never ask. All right, one more poem. Tis the first commercial of the year, and Wrestling with the Future wishes you New Year's cheer. For 2021, good grooming you don't want to lack. No balls that look like they were gigged by New Jack. So go to manscaped.com. Be smart, young lads. Start the year off right for your gonads. Don't have your nether region looking like thistle. Thine should be true to your own meat whistle. The Lawnmower 3.0 will do the trick and have you sporting a main event diction. Diction's very important these days. So go to manscaped.com, use that promo code WrestlingFuture, that's WrestlingFuture, for a generous 20% discount. And remember, if you're looking for a good New Year's resolution, a great looking package is the best solution. The end.
That is true. That is, like you said, promo code WrestlingFuture, 20% off. Our friends at manscaped.com. I want to try and figure out a transition from your amazing poetry, but I can't. So we'll just move along. Something I also wanted to touch on, a positive, and it goes to Raw. What I think has been WWE's weakest program this year, but something that came from Raw that's really surprised me is a faction called the Hurt Business.
Yes.
And the Hurt Business, for those that are unaware, was MVP, who made a Montel Vontavious Porter. He made a surprise return at the Rumble and started building a faction of like talent. And you have currently MVP, Bobby Lashley, Shelton Benjamin, and excuse me, as part of your tag team champions. And it's funny because you've got the tag team champions and Bobby Lashley, the United States champion, and that's a group that was pretty much doing nothing before they were kind of brought together by the MVP character. And now, Bobby Lashley came off that horrendous story involving Lana and Rusev, and like I said, Cedric Alexander and Shelton Benjamin were languishing, pretty much doing nothing. Especially Shelton Benjamin. No offense to the man, they were pretty much doing nothing, and now here they are, tag team champions. They were the first group to step up and fight Retribution, who was a Antifa, at least originally it seemed, Antifa themed faction. But every match they've done, everybody they've competed with, Ricochet and some of the other talent, seems to get a rub from them. Their promo work is good. Their presentation is good. They look like a legit faction, the kind of a Nation of Domination, Four Horsemen style, where the four of them just look like a group that belongs together, and they have the look and they have the swagger. And I want to give them credit because they've been one of the few bright spots, consistent bright spots in a program that has languished for months. So I want to give them a shout out while we're talking about positives from 2020. And that was goes to kind of what you were talking about earlier. But I was wondering if, as you say, you didn't really follow, do you have any thoughts on them?
Well, I absolutely love Shelton Benjamin. I'm a huge fan of his, and I've always thought he should have gotten a lot more than he got. I'm not sure what the reason was, but so to see him get, back kind of in the spotlight, and I think that's what he needed, though. I think he needed somebody like an MVP to come back, who's got the mouthpiece, who's got the mic skills, and where Shelton's a little bit weaker on that. But the guy was an amazing wrestler, and and same thing with Lashley, like you said, he's stuck in that horrible storyline. But the guy's a huge talent. And again, not the best promo guy, but I think MVP coming, like you said, brought it all together. And it's nice to see that.
And that goes to what we were talking about earlier with the positive use of a veteran. MVP's not taking, even though he has wrestled and has competed in a lot of events last year, he didn't take the spotlight away. He hasn't been pushed at the expense of younger talent. He was used very properly in that way. But speaking of talent, pushing talent, something else I want to go on. One of my favorite bits, and I know I'll probably get some flack from some of our audience for this. One of the better spots for me of 2020 was the Smackdown character of Otis. And we were talking about using talent properly. Otis, at the beginning of the year, if you remember, he was the kind of, wasn't he? Yes, heavy machinery. Okay. Yeah, Otis was the goofball to the Tucker straight man. And by the end of the year, I mean, here's a guy, he had won the bank. Which he lost, but that's a whole other story. His moment with Mandy Rose at WrestleMania, I think is one of those that was great, but I think that kind of needed a live crowd. That when the big guy finally got the girl, they're almost creating a modern take on the Dusty Rhodes, American Dream character. Here's a kind of goofy looking fat guy that got the pretty girl because he worked hard and was nice, and he fights for the common man. And I think his character, I think there's a lot they can do with that, especially as they start to push some of the more younger talent, I think. And his in-ring work improved. His promo's kind of same character, but his in-ring work improved. I think personally, this is just me. I'm not speaking as statistics or anything, but I think his presentation last year was one of the better moments too. I wanted to touch on.
Yeah, I think it goes like I was saying with the Yankees. Once a very aging team, now the core is a bunch of young guys that they can use for a long time. Kind of the same thing with a lot of the the AEW and the WWE. Same thing where they have a ton of young talent now, and they're going to be using these guys for the next 10 years or more. Easily.
Speaking of young talent, I want to touch on NXT and AEW. Now, obviously, they've dubbed it the Wednesday Night Wars, but if you remember, when AEW announced they were going to be live on Wednesday night, WWE responded by moving NXT off the WWE network to a time slot on the USA network, making it a 2-hour show, making it a legitimate third, while still a developmental brand. It is really its own brand at this point. There's some talent. I believe there's some talent that'll stay in NXT for their whole careers. Obviously, certain people have moved up. The big rumor coming out I mentioned earlier is Rhea Ripley appears to be done. She's moving to the main roster. I've also seen the Damian Priest attached to that.
I heard that too. Yes.
And obviously, recently in the last few months, you've seen Keith Lee have a lot of success on the main roster. He just had a main event title match he had just had a main event title match against Drew McIntyre. You've had some success with some tag teams and some female talent that's come up. But I think I want to talk about NXT because it's a younger group. But I think just in general, when people talk about modern wrestling, they bash, Raw sucks and the SmackDown sucks and this sucks and that. They always point at NXT as kind of this is what the WWE should be. So I'm wondering if you have your thoughts on how the success NXT's had, to a point, however, because I do want to add that NXT has consistently lost the Wednesday ratings wars to AEW. As a matter of fact, we covered it earlier in the on the show last year that NXT had participated in the Survivor Series, the Raw versus SmackDown versus NXT Survivor Series, brand supremacy, and they were not involved in Survivor Series this year. And the story came out that was Vince McMahon's punishment for losing to AEW. But that's just, it's one of the stories that came out. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on NXT's success being, while still second place, still a very successful brand.
Even after I stopped watching Raw and SmackDown, I still watched NXT for a bit, because to me they were more like in line with the old school wrestling. There was more psychology in the matches. There, it was less gimmick oriented, more really wrestling oriented. So I like it, and I guess I was going to have more of a question than an answer. When I was younger, I mean, of course I grew up in New York, and for a long time all I had was the WWF.
Of course.
But then in the mid '70s we got cable. Now all of a sudden I got CWF, Championship Wrestling from Florida. Now I got to see Gordon Solie and Kevin Sullivan and Dusty Rhodes and Bob Roop and Mark Lewin, the Purple Haze. I only had read about them in the magazines. And then a couple of years after that, I think I was able to watch World Class WCCW, the Von Erichs.
Yeah.
And I think even Southwest Championship Wrestling was promoted by Joe Blanchard with Tully Blanchard out of San Antonio. So I didn't think, I just got to watch one. I could be a fan of all of them. So
right.
I mean, do you have to be either an AEW fan or a WWE fan or NXT fan, or can you be both?
I think, honestly, and this is just my opinion, is the Monday Night Wars back in the 90s when you had WCW versus the WWF, Raw versus Nitro and all, that was a dividing line. Yes, you could be a fan of both. Ratings showed that fans switch back and forth regularly.
I did, all the time.
Right. But there was also dig your heels in camps. Sting versus The Rock versus The Undertaker, Goldberg versus Stone Cold, Shawn Michaels and DDP and the NWO and DX. And you dug your heels in. There were people that were diehard WCW fans that hated the WWF and vice versa. I think today, especially looking at the numbers, the ratings, which we'll touch on here shortly, I think there's more fans today that just watch everything than only watch one. However, I will tell you that ratings and evidence reflects there are more people who watch AEW that hate and refuse to watch the WWE than that are WWE fans that refuse to watch AEW. AEW has a much larger percentage of their fan base being diehard AEW only fans than the WWE has. But I think as far as the WWE goes, NXT is unique enough that you can be a fan of NXT while still not liking Raw or SmackDown, or you can just watch it all. But yeah, I think to answer your question, fans today are mostly open to everything than they used to be. But if you're talking fans that are diehard only one brand, a majority of them are diehard only AEW.
Right.
But actually, speaking of which, you did some research for the show on ratings. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and I'm a numbers guy, but this isn't going to be a Scott Steiner promo, where he's facing Kurt Angle in a three-way, so he has a 33 1/3 match. But since I'm twice the man you are, that brings you down to 16 2/3. I'm not going to do that. So I looked at what I did was I looked at the first 5 weeks of 2020 versus the last 5 weeks for each product, and it's kind of interesting stuff. So SmackDown actually went from an average of 2.468 million in the beginning of 2020 down to 2.162. So they lost about 300,000 viewers, down about 12%. Raw went from 2.27.
Let me interject real quick. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. Didn't SmackDown's Christmas episode, wasn't that their highest viewed episode?
Yeah, that actually made it a lot better because that kicked it up a little bit. Before that, they were
it skewed the average, huh?
It did actually. It would have been worse actually if it had enough of that show. Absolutely.
Well, there you go.
But we're always down from 2.273 down to 1.692 million people per week. So down about 580,000 viewers. And down 25%. That's pretty significant.
That is, and we talked beforehand that Raw had numerous episodes this 2020 that were the lowest viewed episodes of Raw in its history. So this has been the worst year for Raw viewership.
Right. And ironically, the two that stayed the most stable, NXT was only down 4%, and AEW was only down 2%.
There you go.
So they now, and I don't know, like, maybe is there seasonality involved? I mean, is it not a good comparison to do the first five versus the last five, or?
No, that's actually a good indicator, because especially in AEW's case, because at the beginning of 2020, AEW was a relatively new show, and as was NXT on USA Network. So to look at the beginning of the year versus the end of the year, I think is a good comparison, because it shows how many people, especially in the case of Raw, you said it was almost 600,000 viewers.
Right.
That's 600,000 people that watched Raw in January that by December had turned their TVs off.
Right.
And I think that's important, because obviously I wanted to focus on the good, but you have to look at some of the bad for the year. And one of those has been the ratings. And we've talked about it on the show. The idea of wrestling being a big entity, unfortunately, that's gone. The way wrestling used to be, even like I said, I'm 37. I'm the youngest person involved in this show. And even when I was a kid, wrestling was huge. The sports magazines covered it. ESPN covered it. You had the video stores had the wrestling section because of all the tapes coming out of the territories. And then obviously WrestleMania and the biggest pay-per-views, and how big WrestleMania 5 was. And then Starrcade, and had the NWA still fighting in the 80s, and then obviously the Attitude Era in the 90s, and the NWO and WCW, when there was episodes of Raw. The highest rated episode in Raw's history was over 8 million viewers. So I mean, that's 6.8 million more people than are watching today, and
Right.
that was not even 25 years ago. But I think wrestling as a huge entity is gone, and we've talked about it on the show. I won't say it's dead. It's still, they're still going to have that niche crowd that'll watch every week. What's that?
I said it's on life support, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's a niche market. It reminds me of, if I may use a comparison, it reminds me of boxing. In that boxing used to be one of the biggest sports in America, and over time, and this is true story. Over time, it declined. This was back in the 40s through the 30s through the 70s, because parents stopped enrolling their children in boxing classes, because more and more older boxers, parents started seeing what boxing was doing to people. And you still had the market, but boxing kind of became a smaller thing. And then in the 70s and 80s, with your Sugar Ray and your Mike Tyson and your Evander Holyfield, and you had these huge names that all of a sudden boxing was huge again. And then those names kind of started to fade, and then along comes MMA and the UFC, and boxing, it's not gone by any means. I mean, look at the money that the Floyd Mayweather Manny Pacquiao pay-per-view drew but a few years ago. But boxing is a niche market. You have your couple million people that are always going to be fans, and I think wrestling is the same way. It'll never be up there in the echelons like it used to be, unless it massively reboots itself somehow in the future. But you have your couple million fans across the world that will watch it week in, week out, month in, month out, regardless of the quality of the product. And I would say maybe life support's a good example, but it's definitely, it went from being a star to being a niche. It went from being right. It went from main eventing Madison Square Garden to being the indie show in the back in someone's backyard with 50 to 100 people. So
I wonder if but I wonder if is it like completely dead? Do you think there's a chance that, I don't know that it'll ever be as popular as it was? Because wrestling, actually, if you look at wrestling over the years, back in the 40s and 50s, wrestling was gigantic. I mean, It was huge, especially with the advent of TV.
Right.
Once wrestling got on TV, it wasn't one of the most popular shows in America. And then again, it's had ebbs and flows over the years.
At its peak during the territory days, and this is a number that's been thrown around a couple times. Historians like Jim Cornette and whatnot have mentioned it. At its peak in the territory days, they estimate 30 million people a week were watching wrestling across America. I mean, some areas like the Memphis territory was pulling in 2-3 million viewers in just the Memphis territory. I mean, that one city was having as many people watch wrestling as across the entire country watch it today. and you had Florida and Texas and all over the South and Northeast and AWA in Minnesota. But I mean, yeah, every year it's funny. You look at the 50s to the 60s to the 70s, even during the boom age, peak Hulkamania, Ric Flair in the NWA 80s wrestling, when what they called the second golden age, even that was less viewership per capita than you had in the 60s. But I think I wouldn't say it's gone forever. I think what's going to end up having to happen is there's going to have to be some kind of reboot. I mean, and I mean, I don't mean this as disrespectful, but you're a lot older than me, Benny. And so think about the trends in Hollywood, right? When you were a kid, if my math age is correct, one of the biggest things on television was your westerns and your rural shows. When I was a kid, that was because of Star Wars in '77. The biggest things on television was sci-fi or stuff with the sci-fi elements. Your Knight Rider and your Captain Power and your Space Force, and then even shows like the A-Team and MacGyver. It was always your gadgets and your gizmos. James Bond being his second rise with the gadgets and the gizmos. But the stuff that was popular when you were a kid went away. Well, with recent shows, you look at your Game of Thrones bringing back the fan and Lord of the Rings bringing rise to the fantasy genre. Westerns are starting to become bigger again. What's that?
No, I said Westerns are starting to pick up again. Yeah,
exactly. So I mean, to say it's gone forever, something could happen that could bring attention again. If you have a Bruno or a second coming of a Bruno, if you have a second coming of someone like the Von Erichs, or if you have a Lou Thez or somebody like that who just draws the attention of everywhere, even someone like a Buddy Rogers or a Gorgeous George who can just bring in viewers left and right, even people that don't watch wrestling, like, wow, I'm going to watch this guy. This is fun. It might happen, but I don't think it will. Not anytime soon. I think the best litmus test for it is Ring of Honor. I touched on how Ring of Honor is coming back, and Ring of Honor has transitioned back to sports-based wrestling. They're having tournaments. They're presenting it more. You listen to the announcers; they talk about it more like it's a real fight. You watch it; it reminds me of the older shows, the way the NWA Power used to run.
Right.
And I think watch Ring of Honor. If that starts to boom, then some of the older fans might go, hey, this is the wrestling I used to watch. Or maybe the kids, I want to watch wrestling. So the parents, okay, fine, and next thing you know, dad's watching it too, or mom's watching it too. But yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts, Benny?
Well, it's funny you said that, because the last live show that I went to, I guess it was probably about a year and a half ago, was a Ring of Honor show in Lakeland, and it was their TV tapings. And I thought, like, this is good stuff. I mean, I enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. It was, like you said, it was more sports-based wrestling. They did have some high spots and stuff like that, but it was more, and Jay Lethal, I guess, at the time, I think was the champion. Well, I think, he's one of my favorites. I really like him.
Right, he's very good.
He's very funny, but he's also a very good wrestler as well.
I think one of my favorite gimmicks of the last 10 years plus was when Jay Lethal did the Black Machismo, his Macho Man parody. I thought absolutely. that was amazing.
And apparently, like, he did Ric Flair so well that Ric Flair would, like, call his friends and have Jay Lethal do Ric Flair to Ric Flair's friends, because he thought he got such a kick out of it.
That's
not
funny.
An amazingly talented guy. But I mean, I'm a fan of wrestling. I'll be a fan of wrestling until I take my last breath on this earth. And if something can bring it back, I'm all for it. I just want to see it happen.
We'll see. That's actually a great comment there, Benny. And I kind of want to end it there. We're coming to the end of the show. So why don't you tell everybody about the new email setup we have?
Oh, yeah, sure. So we have a new email address. It is called askwwtf@gmail.com. That's askwwtf@gmail.com. What we'd like to do is have you folks send in either a Dear Dan or a Dear Benny, And we'll just some questions, ideas, thoughts, comments about the show, and maybe we'll read a couple every week. Maybe we'll even think of a little contest with it. What do you think, Dan?
Sounds like a plan to me. I mean, half the fun of wrestling is fan involvement, and half the fun of the wrestling podcast is going to be fan involvement.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we'll get us out there. Like I said, you mentioned it, askwwtf@gmail.com. Send us your questions, thoughts. What about you, Benny? You have any parting words?
Well, I mean, it was a hell of a year, and not that the new one's gotten off to much of a better start, as we've seen, but I think I'm the eternal optimist. I always think that there's good right around the corner. So I gotta bet on that. I gotta bet that good things are ahead for both wrestling and for our country, hopefully.
Hopefully. I mean, that's the best way you can ask, best you can ask for. And if there's one thing wrestling's always been good at is being that fantasy escape. So that's a great parting thought.
And reinventing itself.
Absolutely, yes. And 2020 showed us that is more than capable of doing so. Well, Benny, I appreciate you talking with us. For Wrestling with the Future, we can be found on social media anywhere podcasts are listened to. Wrestling with the Future podcast. We're on Twitter at Wrestling Future. That's no G, Wrestling Future. For Benny Scala, I'm Dan Spaciano. Thank you very much. Happy wrestling, everybody.